Good morning. As we talk this morning, I want you to think about this question. How do we define success? More specifically, how do we define success in schools? The one thing that all of us in here have in common is we've all been students. It's one thing that we can all relate to at some point in our lives. I want you to look around at what's going on in here. Look at all the students that are participating in this to make it a success. We have student volunteers, students on the cameras, on the audio. We have students up in the booth. We have student presenters. You guys saw Jazz perform just a little bit ago. What a tremendous success. Zoe and Philip, two of the great co-organizers of this event. How do we know that this event is a success? We know it's a success because of what we see and what we experience. We don't place a number on it. We don't tangibly define what success is at the end of the day. Over the past several weeks, my children, as well as my students, have taken one standardized test after another. And in doing so, so many of them define their success based on that number that they achieve. In a couple of weeks, my AP US History students will take their test to determine if they get college credit. For them, that becomes the single defining moment of success. It doesn't matter what they've done the 9 months leading up to that. For far too many students, this is their defining moment, and it shouldn't be. It's the defining moment for their peers, their parents, the community, politicians, educators. So I want you guys to keep in mind what that idea of success is and what it should be and how we define that. For me, my educational philosophy has changed throughout the years with it. I think as everybody's philosophies change in their jobs. And oftentimes we find inspiration and influence in the things we see. It adds to our perspective with that. Obviously, I see what students do and how it influences them. But different things come along and provide those aha moments for us. One of those was several years ago for me. I was at a parade that my children were participating in. My wife, who's also in education, we were standing along the parade route waiting for them to come through. And several of the schools were coming through on their floats. And they had their banners out for their schools. And one school in particular said, "Career and college readiness begins in kindergarten." Rarely am I caught off guard by something out of the blue like that. Career and college readiness is something that we talk about at the high school level. And we use things like SAT and ACT scores to talk about that. I had never thought about the idea of it beginning in kindergarten. To me, kindergarten is about developing a love for learning, the appreciation for education, and enjoyment. And so I pondered that statement for the rest of the day and the next several weeks. And as I thought more and more about it, I don't read it as career and college readiness begins in kindergarten. I read that testing is what defines your success with that. You see, how do students get to this point where they use these tests as defining moments of their success? Well, it's what we demonstrate to them. It builds their perspective and ideas. And so I thought about how can I try to adjust this for students? Because to tell you the truth, honor students, they place even more emphasis on these ideas with it. And so I started to change my philosophy because so often I viewed my success as a teacher on how my students did on the test. And I'm sure that came across to them. So I began placing less emphasis on the test, more emphasis on the process. And at the end of the day, if you were successful on the test, great. But in the end, I challenged students to think about things, to question things. And so this began my evolution as a teacher. The next big aha moment came for me actually this summer. It's hard to believe where we get inspiration from, but I was watching an old 1980s B movie. It's called Summer School. And Mark Harmon plays Mr. Shoup, a PE teacher, and he's forced into teaching summer school to a group of students who failed their English equivalency test. And these are students who wouldn't have wanted to be in school during the year, let alone during the summer. The vice principal wants to fire Mr. Shoup if all of these students don't demonstrate proficiency on the exam. And so shenanigans ensue and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, Mr. Shoup builds a relationship with these students, and they start to see value in education. None of them, or I shouldn't say none, very few actually pass the exam, demonstrate proficiency. So as Mr. Shoup's about to be fired, all of the parents and the students come into the office and start talking about the impact that Mr. Shoup has had. But most important, even though they didn't demonstrate proficiency, they demonstrated growth. They all had done better than what they had previously done. For me, I've been teaching 17 years. And I thought back to when I started teaching, that's what we used testing to focus on, was growth, not proficiency. Everybody's proficiency was a little bit different. And if students were demonstrating growth, that was success. And so I came into this year with a totally different mindset. I told students and I told parents up front, I'm not worried about your test scores. That's not my goal at the end of the day. And so I challenge students to ask the question throughout the semester, are you better today than you were yesterday? Are you better today than you were a week ago, a month ago, a year ago? And if you were, that's success, and you know that. If you are successful on the exam, that's great. That's an added bonus. I tried to place more emphasis on skills, the critical thinking skills, analysis. Those are the things that make good students in the future, make good citizens in our community. The ones who are willing to challenge the status quo of what's going on. This came full circle in the fall. A colleague of mine shared an article that a guy by the name of Peter Green wrote. He is a contributing writer for education to Forbes magazine. And in his article, Green pointed something out that I didn't realize. We have the first set of college students graduating that have come up through nothing but standardized testing. We should be seeing tangible results under this reform system. Students' lives should be better. Their education should be better. The studies have shown that's not the case. People aren't making more money. Grades aren't better. Nobody can tangibly say that they have a better life at this point with it. And it hit me. I've been teaching 17 years. I am a teacher that is a product of standardized testing. And so as I told students about this idea of, I'm not worried about your test score, and I tell parents that at back to school night, I get looks of horror, looks of disgust, looks of, okay, I get it. But it doesn't matter what the opinion was. It achieved its goal. I got everybody to try and reassess the way they view the emphasis on that testing and whether it's a success or not. So the big question is, how do we change this mentality? Culture does not change overnight. It takes years to do that. But it's got to begin somewhere. Colleges are actually beginning to make the change for us. Recently, the University of Denver decided that they are going to no longer use standardized tests such as ACT and SAT as a requirement for admission or a determining factor. They are one of roughly 1,000 colleges that are moving away from this because they believe that things like GPA, a student's class schedule, extracurricular activities, volunteering, letters of recommendation are better indicators of whether they will be a successful student or not. That's a start. The real change will have to come from us at the local level. And when I say us, I don't just mean teachers. I don't just mean students, but communities. Because schools are a reflection of what communities want and what's important to them. So, to come back to what I was talking about, that question of what defines success. What do you want that to look like? I can tell you I have never had a student come up to me at the end of the year or years later and say, you know what, Mr. Bartholomew, you did a great job of preparing me for that test. Ever. But I do hear students come back and say, thank you for teaching me the skills that I need. Time management, the rigor of what college will be like. Those types of things are the real world skills that define success. So please, please, reevaluate and think how you want success to look in your schools. Thank you.